out there. 61 degrees at the moment at 6:30.
WNYC supporters include Abraham Rama presenting Resistance They Fought Back, exploring the unknown story of Jewish resistance against the Nazis as told by Holocaust survivors, their children, and historians, now playing at Firehouse Cinema.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Marketplace is supported by C3 Generative AI, verifiable traceable answers, secure hallucination-free, LLM-agnostic, IP liability-free. Learn more at c3.ai.
A thing I think I'm going to be saying a lot the rest of this year. Political news? Sure, yes, of course. But remember, this economy waits for no one. From American Public Media, this is Marketplace.
Marketplace is supported by Live Oak Bank, helping savvy businesses optimize their high-yield online savings accounts. Rate information is at liveoakbank.com/radio. And by Certified Financial Planner Professionals. Learn more about CFP professionals at letsmakeaplan.org.
In Los Angeles, I'm Kai Ryssdal. It is Friday today. This one is the 12th of April. Good as always to have you along, everybody. This is going to be, all right, it already is a political cycle unlike any other for reasons we are all aware of. But alongside that is a very real need to keep one's eye on the economic ball, which is what we're going to do today. And we're going to do it with Neela Richardson. She's at ADP, and Rachel Siegel. She is at the Washington Post. Hey, you two.
Hi, Kai.
Hi.
Neela, let me start with you. We have to start, I think, with inflation. CPI came in this week a little bit hotter than anybody wanted. Were you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised because the driver of inflation, the big one, shelter costs, it just hasn't really relented. And it harkens back to the fact that there's still a housing affordability problem in the country. There's still inventory shortages. And so that's not cyclical. It's not something that can be fixed in the short term. I think what was the surprise here is the uptick in gases and the driver of insurance premiums, which is playing havoc with the index right now. But it's always something. Shelter costs have been a constant with the inflation these days.
It is always something. Rachel, on your first Friday with us, let me throw you straight in to the jaws of the belly of the beast, as it were. Put yourself inside the mind of Jay Powell, the Fed chair, obviously, and imagine his conversation inside his brain saying, well, do we pause now forever? Do we wait and see what happens? What is Jay Powell thinking?
Well, I would have to assume that those thoughts are probably being asked by many PhD economists around Jay Powell. If I had to imagine what those questions look like, it has to do with, this question that they've been asking, is this a blip? Is this a bump? Or is this a more worrisome trend? And March really seemed to cement the latter, right? So the question is, well, what do they do with that? How many cuts does that mean? And when do they do it? And they're juggling not only with the number of cuts, but the timeline, right? Because it's not like the Fed is considering cuts in a calendar year that only revolves around the Fed. There's an election coming up, and the closer they cut to November, the trickier that pivot is going to get. I'm
glad you went there. We will finish that thought in about 2.5 minutes, because that's where I want to end. But Neela, let me ask you this. How are we going to know? Actually, not how are we going to know, because we're going to know by the data. But is your sense that inflation is stuck where it is, which is slightly elevated from where the Fed wants it to be? Or is it bumpy and eventually the Fed's going to win out?
I think it's bumpy and eventual, but that eventual may have a very long tail. I sit and look at a lot of payroll data at ADP about 25 million workers. And what I see is an uptick in wages, especially for people who've changed jobs in the last year. And so labor costs is going to be a big factor also into the input of goods. And I think that we're going to see, match with that very hot employment picture that we saw last week, 300,000 jobs created in this economy, that the labor market is still in play and wages are not to be ruled out as not triggering more inflation, but keeping inflation kind of stalled at where it is for a longer period of time.
Wait, say more about that. In the labor market is still in play. What do you mean by that? Because that obviously, Powell and the gang are keeping a really close eye on that.
As they should, because wages are the bridge between the labor market and inflation. And usually with higher interest rates, people, and when I say people, I always mean economists, assume that there is this trade-off, that with higher interest rates, it's really going to make the labor market vulnerable and the unemployment rates will spike up. Even Powell himself said at Jackson Hole last year that there will be pain by the consumer, by the worker, but we haven't seen that. What we've seen is a very strong, very resilient labor market where wage growth has been robust and solid. And if wages keep that pace, it's not really consistent with a 2% inflation target. So you add that to shelter costs and the higher energy costs we saw last month, and you get a really a complex picture for the Fed to keep track of.
Is it possible, do you think, Rachel, that the first move by the Fed is not a cut, but a hike in rates?
I feel like that hasn't quite entered the conversation yet. And obviously, Neela, please correct me if the winds seem to be shifting that way. But it seems that right now, at least, the conversation is still between cuts or just higher for longer. And the higher for longer assumes staying where they are. There isn't an urgency to cut. The economy is looking really strong. And unless we started to see a weakening in the kind of labor market strength that Neela was just talking about, they might not have a reason to cut anytime soon. I think, though, that would lean towards just keeping rates where they are. Then again, we've learned time and time again that just because that's the way the economy looks right now doesn't mean that it'll stick that way. And we could be having a different conversation depending on where the data goes.
Yeah, well, so Neela, quickly, when I had Powell at the San Francisco Fed like 2 weeks ago now, and I asked him, I asked him in essence, what do you make of this economy? And he did all but shrug and say things are still weird. How much is the weirdness a factor?
Weirdness is a factor because we're not expecting the labor market to perform in the way it is. And we've seen consumers be pretty resilient to very steep price increases for a really long time. Now, I do think that consumer staying power is softening a little bit, but yeah, the economy is strong. And by the way, Kai, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Totally.
I mean, let's not complain about the good things in life. This is good that the economy is strong, but as Rachel mentions, it means that the urgency to cut is not there. And then without an urgent reason, an urgent trigger to make some kind of definitive action, I think the Fed and Chair Powell is perfectly happy holding this position. Right.
Totally. These are good problems to have. Rachel, very quickly on that note you struck before about the politics of the Federal Reserve and to where I started this program today. The politics of this economy are going to come more pronounced over the next 6 months, especially if the Fed does decide to start cutting rates into the closer we get to Election Day. Discuss that for a minute and 10 seconds, please.
Sure. This is going to bump up really close up to the wall and then right into that exact home stretch where President Biden and former President Trump are trying to drive home their own economic agendas. And even though the Fed's own decisions, they say, will be totally independent from that process, they don't operate in a vacuum. Those moves are going to affect the housing market and other parts of the broader economy that we already know are playing a massive role in how voters are thinking about who they're going to cast their vote for November. So the Fed might otherwise wish the timeline was different, but this is just how 2024 is shaping up.
It is indeed. Rachel Siegel at the Washington Post, Neela Richardson at ADP on a Friday afternoon. Thanks, you two.
Thank you, Kai.
Wall Street on this Friday, well, not so great, actually, for some of the reasons we just spent 7 minutes and 20 seconds talking about. We'll have the details when we do the numbers. All right, let's talk prices a little bit more here, specifically the prices of goods that we import into this economy. We got some new data on that this morning from the Labor Department. Import prices up 0.4% last month, a bigger bump than we saw in February, thanks in large part to the cost of imported fuel. Straightforward so far, yes. But things do get more interesting when you look at where this import inflation is coming from. Imports from Mexico and Canada last month, more expensive. Imports from China and Japan, cheaper. Marketplace's Justin Ho has more on what's going on.
Part of it has to do with the types of products those countries are sending us, says Ed Gresser, Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute.
Canada and Mexico are big sources of cars and auto parts and of energy. Japan and China, much more consumer manufactured goods, technology products.
And while consumer goods and electronics got cheaper in March, auto and energy imports got more expensive.
And that will show up more in our trade with Canada and Mexico than anywhere else because the weight of those products is larger there.
U.S. companies have also been trading more with Mexico and Canada lately, especially after all the trade drama with China in the last few years and the supply chain congestion earlier in the pandemic. Teresa Fort, a professor at Dartmouth, says U.S. companies see Mexico in particular as a good substitute with low-cost manufacturing and closer proximity.
So you could see firms that are shifting from producing in China to producing in Mexico for the U.S. market.
Import prices are also being affected by the value of those countries' currencies. Megan Schoenberger, senior economist at KPMG, says all that investment in Mexico is helping to push up the value of the peso, which makes imports from there more expensive. Meanwhile, the Japanese yen is way down. So
we would expect import prices to fall from Japan, given depreciation in their own currency.
Schoenberger says China's currency is down too, in large part because its central bank is trying to stimulate a stagnant economy.
And so they're cutting rates, which is diverging from the Federal Reserve, which can, for these central banks, cause currency depreciation.
And that helps to make imports from China cheaper too. I'm Justin Ho for Marketplace.
We told you the other day about a new-ish study that shows immigrants in this economy start new businesses at much higher rates than native-born individuals do. We're going to continue that theme of immigrant entrepreneurship today with this next installment of our series, My Economy.
My name is Adrian Espinosa. I'm owner of Empanada Club in Portland, Maine. We make and sell Bolivian-style empanadas, selling them at farmers markets, breweries, festivals, concerts. I moved to the U.S. 8 years ago from Bolivia. I left my career. I didn't want to do what I was doing there. I was working in an office job. And around Portland, the first job that I could get was restaurant jobs. I had no idea how to cook, but once here, I learned everything. So I opened the business in 2018, basically when my partner was pregnant. And I was like, okay, I cannot keep working as a line cook because I'm not going to be able to support my daughter and her mom. When I started, I wanted to sell packaged empanadas, like frozen, so I don't have to spend my weekends on pop-ups. But soon I realized that, you need a big name to put your product in the market. And a friend texted me saying, oh, you should start doing farmers markets. So I did. And, it was nice to sell 50 empanadas that day. I was like, finally I got some money coming into my pocket. Over the last few years, basically the rent of my kitchen, it went up. So I rent a space in a commercial kitchen. It used to be $10 an hour and it went up to $12 an hour. So you have an idea that probably I switched from $600 a month to $750 a month. It's a challenge, to keep up because it's not the only expense that went up. So I've been managing the higher prices with many different ways. Like I rise up my prices of my product. I used to sell the empanadas at $5.50 to $6. Now I'm selling them at $7 to $8. Looking back, I just think, and looking where I'm now, I feel really happy of myself. And I do enjoy too. Sometimes people come by to my booth and start